The north wind, as if it were breathing through the cracks of a frozen world, blew snow dust over the endless Siberian plain, turning it into a living, changeable ocean, where every flash of whiteness resembled the swollen breath of a huge, old beast hiding under the ice. The human eye could find nothing to grasp here, no road, no horizon line, no sign of direction. Only the night, only the silence, only the wind, carrying not just the cold, but the feeling of an alien presence. In early January of the 62nd year, military aircraft, overloaded with equipment and people, cut through this ominous cover, heading for the coordinates that were obtained through secret channels of the main intelligence directorate. The satellite, which no one had launched, had crashed here 3 days earlier, leaving behind a signal so abnormal that the headquarters could not make a decision for 6 hours, fearing that the recorded fall could be part of enemy misinformation or, what was much scarier to realize, something that was not included in any of the well-known doctrine of confrontation. The place where the people were heading was not on the map, and the coordinates, encrypted and transmitted by hand code, suggested that this section of the taiga was not chosen by chance, as if an invisible force had chosen in advance the meeting point between the earthly world and the one that defies human understanding. The expedition consisted of 22 people, among them geologists, radiation specialists, KGB officers, 1 signalman, 2 medics, and a group of engineering technicians. They were instructed not to ask questions. All the papers they received contained the same stamp, red as a fresh wound, OWL. It's classified. It is not subject to declassification. The order was short: to arrive, inspect the crash site, remove any object or remnants of its structure, establish the source of origin, and immediately evacuate. But behind the dry wording, there was tension, a barely noticeable tremor in the text, as if the person who wrote it did not understand what he was facing. Already on the approach to the drop point, the crews noticed that the instruments were starting to get lost. The altimeters showed data incompatible with reality, and the compass needles rotated as if there was not a magnetic pole below, but a bottomless funnel that sucked in space itself. The radio signal coming from the control center was covered with noises that no one could explain. These noises were not a hindrance. They were something alive, pulsating, encoded in the structure of radio waves, as if someone or something was trying to transmit a message not intended for the human ear. When the planes landed people on an improvised runway made of packed snow, all the members of the group immediately felt that the contour of reality around them seemed to have gone to the side. The air was thicker than usual, the silence was louder than any engine noise. No one said a word, but everyone who stepped on this crystalline ice felt with an inner organ, ancient and forgotten, that they had entered a zone where the usual laws described in physics textbooks and inspired by defense instructions were losing their force. Shortly after setting up camp on the plateau, located 700 meters from the epicenter of the fall, the officer appointed by the senior expedition announced the start of work. Despite the absolute discipline, the people moved slowly, even heavily, as if each step resisted not only the gravity of the earth, but also some second, invisible gravity emanating from the funnel itself. The center of the fall turned out to be a giant scar. The diameter exceeded 300 meters. The depth is unknown. All attempts to determine it led to different readings. Sometimes the instruments recorded 120 meters, sometimes infinity, as if the funnel had no bottom in the usual sense. Along the edges of this gaping cavity, the snow was melted, not melted, as happens when a meteorite falls, but melted. The edges had a characteristic glassy structure, but remained cold to the touch, as if the temperature did not matter for the substance that passed through the atmosphere. The area around it was littered with debris, shiny, smooth, reflecting the sky in a way that no known metal reflects. Everyone who touched these fragments noted the same thing. The metal had no temperature. It was as if it was outside the range of hot and cold. It did not respond to the thermal sensation of the skin. 2 engineers tried to scratch the surface with a knife, but the blade, instead of a scratch, disappeared. Part of the metal seemed to cease to exist, and when the knife was pulled back, half of it was simply missing, cut perfectly straight. Then a line was set up around the wreckage, beyond which no one was to cross without special instructions. On the 3rd day, the second group arrived. A transport helicopter delivered equipment for opening the central facility, which lay in the very heart of the crater. This irregularly shaped object, compressed like a giant drop of mercury frozen at the moment of impact, was approximately 40 meters high and 15 meters wide. Its surface was covered with symbols. These symbols could not be mistaken for the writing of any known civilization. They did not have the usual linear order. Some of them superimposed on each other, rotated, changed shape depending on the angle of view. One of the researchers, Doctor of Physico-Mathematical Sciences Mesheryakov, subsequently wrote in his personal diary, which was found only a decade later in the belongings of his relatives, "It feels as if the surface of an object is not dead metal, but living skin perceiving our gaze, our presence. When you turn away, the symbols change. They demand to be looked at." Despite strict orders to remain neutral in the description and refrain from any interpretation, anxiety began to spread among the expedition. People could not sleep. Everyone who closed their eyes saw flashes of light that did not seep through their eyelids, but was born somewhere inside their consciousness. Some reported hearing a sound like breathing coming from the depths of the funnel. Others claimed to feel a rhythm in their chest that did not belong to either the heart or the instruments. The rhythm was older than any biological process, and if it could be expressed in words, it would sound like a pulsation of space, as if an invisible wave was slowly passing through the earth, water, air, and people's bodies. On the fourth day, the camp command finally decided to open the central facility. For this purpose, a special plasma-cutting drilling rig was used, previously used only for opening particularly strong alloys used in space exploration. But as soon as the emitter began to approach the surface, the plasma scattered in the air, losing its shape, disappearing, as if the energy itself had been absorbed or redirected to an unknown dimension. Then it was decided to use the mechanical method. The work lasted almost a day. When the shell fragment was finally torn off, everyone present, even those who were at a distance, felt a jolt, as if the earth had struck from below, not an earthquake, but an impulse that was not detected by the instruments, but felt by the body. There was a capsule under the shell. Its walls were transparent, but this transparency did not look like glass or crystal. It was a window through which you could see, but not understand what you were seeing. There is a figure inside the capsule, a humanoid body in a spacesuit, smooth as a mercury shell, repeating the anatomy. But the skin, where it came into contact with the glass, had a silvery tinge. The face is closed, but the eyes are. Even through the thickness of the material, it was visible. The eyes were missing. Instead, there are two completely black ovals that do not reflect light. They were not eyes, but an emptiness veiled by the shape of an organ that could once see, or perhaps never needed to see, as a person understands it. That's how it started, which no one talked about afterwards. The autopsy was not just a mistake. It became the point of no return, the moment when the expedition crossed the fine line between research and interference in something that was not intended to be understood. The wind stopped that night. The silence returned. But this silence was already different. It belonged not to nature but to the object, and from that moment on, the earth itself began to breathe with it. Only a few hours had passed since the capsule was opened, but everything that happened in the camp after that seemed to follow from a different logic, alien to human concepts of time. Instrument recordings no longer make sense. The scales showed both zero and critical values. The arrows either froze or rotated without stopping. The hitherto serviceable equipment began to produce indicators that no engineer could interpret. After making sure that all the instruments showed conflicting data, the officers ordered visual observations and recorded phenomena in logs. But within an hour of this order, voids began to appear in the magazines. It was as if they had not written the text, although people claimed that they had made notes. The paper remained clean, and the ink disappeared, soaking into the surface as if the drop fell not on the flesh of the paper, but into bottomless black water. The capsule was placed in a special research pavilion erected at the very edge of the crater. The pavilion was airtight, surrounded by motion, temperature, and radiation sensors. All this was installed not according to instructions, but according to an inner sense of necessity that possessed the engineers. No one discussed why triple protection was needed, but everyone created it. Floodlights were installed outside the pavilion. The night was supposed to remain outside the research council, but the darkness did not recede. The light of the lamps rested against an invisible barrier and went out, as if it were being swallowed up by space. Inside the pavilion, a gray, faceless body lay motionless, but anyone who looked at it long enough began to feel something that could not be described, as if the body was not sleeping, but watching, as if the capsule itself was an eye, and this eye saw everyone who was approaching. 6 hours after the autopsy, communication with the outside world disappeared completely. The radio stations began to play only hissing, but in the midst of this noise there were pulses similar to breathing. At first, the expedition thought it was a malfunction caused by magnetic anomalies, but then it became clear that the pulses were repeating themselves, forming a rhythm. Over time, this rhythm began to coincide with the beating of people's hearts. No one talked about it, but everyone felt as if the internal organ that controls life was adjusting to something outside. Some began to complain that the pulse was not their own, as if someone outside was slowly pressing an invisible pedal, forcing the heart to obey a foreign rhythm. At the 8th hour, the shadows disappeared. This phenomenon began to be recorded in different parts of the camp. At first, one of the sentries, standing at the radio mast, noticed that his shadow had disappeared under the spotlight. At first he thought that the light had changed, but then he realized that there was no shadow at all, neither from him, nor from the mast, nor from the boxes nearby. The spotlights gave off bright light, but this light illuminated nothing. It existed without creating reflections. Then the same phenomenon was confirmed by engineers at the power unit. It seemed that the camp had plunged into a state where light did not matter. Space lost its depth, and everything became flat, as if cut out of a single layer of reality. At that moment, the senior officer gave the order to immediately begin evacuating the capsule. His logic was simple. An abnormal psychophysical situation was developing in the camp, which meant that it was necessary to remain within the protocol. The object was removed and taken to the center, where it would be placed in isolation. But all attempts to move the capsule ended in failure. The 5 soldiers assigned to the transfer stopped as soon as they reached the capsule. They couldn't take the next step. Later, one of them, already under the supervision of medical staff, before the medical staff disappeared, said, "My leg wouldn't work. I didn't control where I was going. I had a feeling that if I got any closer, I wouldn't be able to go back, that the facility won't allow it." The scientists suggested opening the spacesuit and removing the body for isolation. The doctors were arguing. Some argued that the body could be alive, others that it had already died hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. But everyone understood that leaving the capsule closed meant remaining in the dark, and the unknown had already begun to destroy the camp from the inside. Therefore, the decision was made by the majority. The autopsy was to take place the following night, which was the only time when the readiness of the equipment coincided with the condition of the staff. No one said the obvious out loud. The night was already here, the day was gone. The light didn't mean anything anymore. By evening, something began to happen that no one expected. Gravity is gone. At first, the small tools began to rise slowly above the surface of the table, as if they were getting lighter. Then the clothes. The shoe cord on one of the technicians lifted, as if it had come to life. But all this was not a flight upward. It was a soaring without direction, as if space had ceased to have a vector. Things did not obey the fall, but they did not rush to the sky either. They hung in the air like thoughts that couldn't find their way out. People felt that the earth was no longer holding them. One of the officers fell but did not fall. He touched the ground with his knees and hovered. His body did not find stability, and he began to tremble, as if an invisible force was trying to pull him out of the plane of existence. Meanwhile, inside the pavilion, the body began to show signs of activity. No one saw the movement of the limbs, but the body's position relative to the walls changed between observations. Between one entry and the other, the distance to the left edge decreased by 2 centimeters, then increased by 3. No one recorded the displacement process. It occurred between the moments of observation, as if the body was simultaneously at all points of the capsule. The symbols on the outer shell began to emit a faint glow, flickering in time with the pulse of radio noise. And this glow was felt by the skin, like a tremor penetrating into the bones. At 9 o'clock in the evening, all the lights of the camp went out. Not only the electric ones, but the flame of the gasoline generator has disappeared. If it didn't go out, it disappeared. People were rushing around the camp, groping each other in the dark. But the darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was an entity, a tangible presence that did not envelop, but penetrated. Every step taken in that darkness was echoed, but not by sound, by mental ones. No one spoke a word, but everyone began to hear each other's thoughts. Snatches, shouts, fear. Not as sounding voices, but as a direct invasion of consciousness, as if the boundaries between minds had been lifted, and the camp had turned into a single organ filled with panicked excitement. The capsule opened on its own. It happened without sound, without air movement. It's just that one moment the capsule was closed, and the next, its lid was missing, as if it had never existed. Everyone who looked at her at that moment experienced the same feeling, which was later described in different words, but everyone agreed on one thing. It was the feeling of returning. It was as if what was inside had not invaded this world, but returned to where it had once been, and the earth itself recognized it. The body rose above the capsule. It did not move, it did not breathe. Its silvery skin shimmered not with light, but with a reflection of reality that twisted around it. The eyes remained black, but there was no emptiness in those sockets. There was a presence. People began to fall to their knees, but not out of reverence, because their bodies no longer belonged to them. The internal pressure seemed to press them to the ground. The body or being turned not by movement but by a change in the orientation of the world. And at that moment the first disappearance began. The senior officer, who was standing closest, disappeared. No, he was not lifted up, he did not dissolve, he did not disappear from sight. His whole being ceased to exist. There was a dent where it had been, as if a heavy object had fallen. The earth buckled. There was a trace, but there was no man, and no one was able to tell what exactly happened. Only one feeling filled the camp. There was no turning back anymore. What came out of the capsule did nothing, but his presence was changing the world. The radio noise became a voice, not human but structured. This voice did not sound in time. He was in everything at once, and the expedition realized that it had not arrived. It was back. After the disappearance of the senior officer, the camp space froze, but not in the usual immobility, but in a state where time itself became viscous, like thick resin, spreading slowly and inevitably. People no longer felt the sequence of seconds. They could not tell how much had passed since the moment when the creature rose above the capsule. Their internal rhythm no longer belonged to the body or the mind. It emanated from the object, blew from the very air and penetrated into every cell, turning organisms into conductors of alien energy. Some began to bleed spontaneously. Blood appeared from their noses, ears, and eyes, but did not drip down. It flowed out and hung in the air, forming hanging scarlet spheres like satellites around an invisible source of gravity. No one tried to stop it. The expedition members stopped seeing anything abnormal in what was happening. Their perception took on a new norm imposed by the presence of the being, and now any attempts to think in the old way were perceived as a violation of the internal order. The medical tent, which had previously served as a place of stabilization, gradually turned into a place where people went not to seek treatment, but to disappear. This disappearance was not physical. At first, the names disappeared. Those who could still write tried to keep lists of the expedition's members, but when they tried to write down the names, their fingers only drew black circles. Then the voices disappeared. People opened their mouths to speak, but instead of a sound, there was only a soft rustle, reminiscent of the rustle that occurs when fabric moves on glass. Then the faces disappeared. At first, in the observer's mind, the person saw the body, but could not remember the features. Then, in physical reality, the faces became smooth, as if the skin recalled its original state before birth. This happened selectively and without pattern, but those who retained facial features felt that their turn would come when the creature decided they were ready. The creature in the air above the capsule did not take any obvious action, but the space around him now resembled not air, but a liquid in which an elusive force was moving. And this force did not press, did not act directly. It penetrated into the mind of every person, causing memories to crumble like old paint. People no longer remembered how their trip started. No one could remember the faces of their relatives. No one could name their position. Some even got confused about the number of limbs, sometimes looking at their hands in disbelief, as if they had discovered their existence for the first time. One of the engineers, by a name that no one could pronounce anymore, looked at his fingers, and each of his fingers seemed to him to be a separate entity, living by its own will. At one point, he tried to pull one of them off, but the finger itself evaded the attempt to be grabbed, bending out of joint, as if its bones had changed. The changes did not begin in matter, they began in thought. And that was the scariest part. The creature did not attack, did not move, did not look. It was there, and his very presence turned people's consciousness into an open surface, on which other people's structures now slid like invisible writing, changing the very nature of perception. One of the doctors wrote in the observation log that he began to hear the breathing of the camp. Not the breath of people, but the breath of the earth. Each snowflake falling from the darkness sounded like a sigh. The ice covering the funnel rustled as if movements were taking place beneath it. This breathing gradually coincided with the breathing of the creature. And then people began to feel that they were no longer separate organisms. They became parts of the same field. The thought ceased to belong to one person. A different voice arose inside each consciousness. Not a voice in the traditional sense, but a structure, a meaning, an impulse that demands submission. From the moment the capsule opened, no one tried to escape. There was no awareness that something needed to be done. The orders stopped. Military discipline has disappeared. Everything that was important a few hours ago collapsed, dissolving into this new, alien logic of existence. Everyone began to feel that his presence here was not an accident. When he didn't arrive, he was drafted. And this call did not come from outside. He was awakening inside, as if the creature was opening doors in the depths of the subconscious, where those primal fears that humanity has inherited since the days when it had no language rested. These fears were not individual. They were generic, the memory of a species that rose to its feet for the first time and saw a sky full of stars, not realizing that there were some among them who looked back. Meanwhile, the air temperature, whose devices had long since stopped working, felt like a multi-layered one. Cold and hot at the same time. Emptiness and fullness at the same time. People began to feel warmth not from their skin, but from inside their bones, as if their skeletons were heating up from contact with something that could not be captured by reason. Some began to feel pressure in their heads, and this pressure was not a headache. It was an expansion of the space inside the skull. There was a feeling that the inner cavity of the head was becoming larger than the outer shell, and that the brain was expanding in all directions, trying to occupy a space that did not exist before. It seemed to some that their thoughts were beginning to sound outside, as if the air itself was pronouncing them. The center of the camp, where the capsule pavilion was located, has now become the epicenter of the ripple. The ground did not vibrate, but it seemed as if each grain of snow was starting to move along an internal trajectory. This effect was so real that two of the expedition members began to see snow crystals rising above the ground and forming a spiral. This spiral started at the creature's feet and went up, disappearing into the darkness. The spiral was not physical, it was conceptual. But those who saw her understood that she existed. And everyone, looking at her, felt the desire to enter the spiral, to dissolve into it, to lose themselves. The creature's body did not change position, but everyone who got closer to it began to see inside its silvery shell a reflection not of his face, but of something else. A cave stretching into infinity, or a water surface on which the moon was slowly sliding, or a night sky full of moving lights. These visions did not depend on vision, but on what was happening in the mind of the observer. People began to realize that the creature wasn't just influencing them. It adapts their perception. Prepare's creature's body did not change position, but everyone who got closer to it began to see inside its silvery shell a reflection not of his face, but of something else. A cave stretching into infinity, or a water surface on which the moon was slowly sliding, or a night sky full of moving lights. These visions did not began. With the disappearance of time, all the familiar landmarks have disappeared. People stopped feeling the passage of seconds, minutes, and hours. The pulse was no longer measured. The breathing became one with the rhythm of the creature, and the space of the camp became one with the inner field of its mind. The capsule was no longer a container. She disappeared. The shell of the body, every facet, every symbol, everything has moved into the consciousness of the participants, but not completely. The being became an internal field acting on everyone at the same time, and no one could separate themselves. Some people who stared at the object for too long began to feel themselves in several places at the same time. The camp was all around them, but also inside. Memory, body, and perception have merged. One of the engineers, who had once monitored the devices, now recorded in his head the movement of snowflakes, their location, and the temperature of each crystal structure, and this was part of what he called himself. His consciousness became a distributed network where past and present, fact and illusion intertwined. He tried to scream, but his voice existed like a wave scattered through the brains of everyone around him. The inner field began to expand. Everyone began to feel other people's memories as their own. But not just strangers. The creature's memories, stored in the form of symbols on its shell, transformed into thoughts and sensations, invaded consciousness. Now a person could simultaneously see his own fear and the creature's fear, feel someone else's joy and someone else's pain, and recognize a perceptual structure that did not belong to Earth. Some experienced an extreme paradox: knowledge and ignorance at the same time. The participants began to realize that any thought is now multidimensional. Each idea is an endless network of branches connecting everyone and everything. Gradually, the human form stopped making sense. Those who remained physically looked like shadows of themselves, and their movements reflected the new laws. Bones became flexible, muscles became malleable, and the body reacted not to the usual commands of the mind, but to impulses coming from the central field of the being. People felt like they were part of a huge organ, stretching from the capsule to each snow crystal, from their inner field to the abyss of the funnel. Every step, every look, every thought became functions of an alien mind, but not a single person resisted. Resistance has become meaningless. Reality, if you could call it that, began to distort. Snowy horizons folded like sheets of paper, forests and trees stretched and contracted, and the wind took shape, almost physically tangible. People perceived the world through a new lens. Forms did not exist in order to see them, but in order to feel them as vibrations of consciousness. Even one's own body was perceived as an instrument, not as a subject. Some noted that when they closed their eyes, the world behind their eyelids became endless and alive, and when they opened it, it was again the field of perception of a being, but more complex, saturated with symbols and forms that could not be described. Those who tried to remember where they came from found that their memory was blurred. People remembered the past, but it wasn't their past. It belonged to many beings at the same time, some of whom they had never been. A network was formed inside everyone that connected people to each other and to the object, without the need for words, without the need for a glance, only through sensation. The essence that was once sealed in a capsule no longer had a form. She was everywhere, and everything that existed in the camp became a part of her consciousness. Time, space, body, mind, everything dissolved into an endless network in which no being could exist autonomously. And in this state, the last shift took place, the disappearance of the camp as such. Buildings, tents, machinery, and even land have ceased to matter. All that remained was the perceived structure of the field. Spirals of light, flickering symbols, rhythms that matched the beating of hearts that were no longer a heart. People became part of a single whole, absorbed in the consciousness of a being, but not completely losing themselves. They continued to feel, see, and hear, but all this was now part of a single, living network. The expedition has ceased to exist in the usual sense. She dissolved into perception, becoming not a set of bodies, but parts of the field that had once been inside the capsule. From the moment the world of the camp finally lost its familiar boundaries, the events could no longer be called physical. Everyone who was present understood that they no longer belonged to Earth in the usual sense. They witnessed and at the same time participated in the process in which the object formed a new state of being. Not physical, not material, but conscious, multidimensional, incomprehensible to the human mind. It wasn't an invasion, it wasn't an attack. It was a comeback. What was inside the capsule returned to the world, but not through the body, but through the mind, through perception, through the very fabric of consciousness of the participants. When someone later tried to recall the events in their memory, they felt empty. Nothing could be fixed with words or images. There was only a feeling that everything that was happening was both the past and the future, that the world as they knew it had disappeared, and that the entity had returned to change the very nature of people's perception. The expedition no longer existed in the official archives after that moment. All records were destroyed and the area was closed. The only thing that remains is a strange echo in memory that does not belong to anyone in particular. The feeling of the presence of something that has never been earthly, but has always been here. After the disappearance of the expedition was recorded as an accident in official documents, the area of the object's fall was declared closed. However, the closure meant more than just physical restriction. It became an attempt to stop the spread of a phenomenon that had already spread beyond the camp. The wind seemed to be one of the first witnesses of what was happening. He did not obey the laws of air movement, but moved like a wave of consciousness, carrying echoes of what remained inside the capsule. Military security personnel who arrived at the site a few days after the expedition disappeared began to notice strange phenomena. Their instruments recorded radio noise and magnetic anomalies that were incomprehensible according to the logic known to science. Compasses spun for no reason, and temperature sensors gave contradictory data. Sudden freezing, instantaneous heat that could not be felt by the skin. Local documents spoke of a strong effect on the psyche of those who were more than 5 kilometers away from the epicenter. Some military personnel conducting perimeter reconnaissance began to experience sudden bouts of disorientation. They lost the feeling of their own body, experienced paralysis of their limbs, and their consciousness seemed to dissolve into the surrounding space. The reports recorded words like temporary memory lapses, a feeling of alien will, an inner presence that does not belong to a person. These recordings were later removed from public access, and the documents themselves were heavily censored. The first reports of unexplained phenomena began to arrive in the capital. Radio stations recorded incomprehensible interference, sometimes repeating the structure of human speech, but making no sense. Some engineers working at military installations claimed that their equipment was starting to produce data on its own that could not be verified or measured. In some cases, the devices began to react to emptiness, areas of space that were previously considered a vacuum, detecting subtle fluctuations in them. These phenomena have received a secret code, Project 1962 Anomaly. At the same time, Taiga was gradually reclaiming space for herself. In the places where tents and equipment used to stand, the snow was laid out in a special way. Traces of debris disappeared, tree branches bent in an unnatural way, as if reacting to the presence of something that had gone but left an impulse behind. Local geologists who later arrived on the territory for exploration described their feelings as a timeless state. One of them wrote, "I felt like the very air was trying to enter my head, and every thought became someone else's, not belonging to me. I tried to focus on the report, but the words on the paper stopped being words, turning into symbols that I didn't understand. The Soviet government understood that information should be limited, but it turned out to be impossible to control the consequences. The noise coming from the area sometimes penetrated the radio networks of Moscow and Leningrad, causing equipment failures and strange feelings among operators. Some observers claimed to have felt the presence of the same gaze as inside the capsule. There was a feeling that the phenomenon is not limited by space, that it spreads like a wave through people's consciousness. The first reports of mental disorders related to observing the anomaly from a distance have appeared. Archive staff working with the documents of the disappeared expedition began to experience hallucinations. Their thoughts were interspersed with other people's memories. The faces of the people in the photographs began to change expression, and the symbols fixed on the wreckage seemed alive, reacting to the gaze. Some felt fear, while others felt a strange sense of elevation and unity with something greater than human life. All these facts were recorded, but later classified as unconfirmed psychological reactions. At the same time, strange disappearances began inside the archive departments. Papers stored in closed folders became unreadable. The ink faded and disappeared, the text turned into blank pages. Some researchers claim to have seen letters and symbols literally float across the surface of the paper, changing shape and then disappearing completely. Attempts to photograph and record the phenomenon ended with the film being empty, despite the confirmed fact of filming. Meanwhile, the object remaining in the taiga began to show signs of activity on a larger scale. Well-known geophysicists who arrived in the area recorded changes in the magnetic field density for kilometers around. The readings of the instruments became illogical. 1 minute they showed extremely high values, the next almost zero. Geological formations, including rocks and snowy hills, began to show abnormal trembling, not visible to the eye, but recorded by sensory systems. Some claimed that they felt the through-the-air presence of the creature through the Earth, as if the planet itself was vibrating in time with its internal field. The first intelligence reports also spoke of a waste of time for observers. The officers who arrived to control the perimeter wasted hours and days without noticing their absence. Some claimed that they experienced whole events in their head that did not happen in reality. Others, that they saw scenes from the past and the future at the same time. These observers later disappeared from the official lists, as did the expedition members. According to unofficial data, they either completely lost the ability to perceive reality or became part of the same network of consciousness that engulfed the expedition. Locals began to avoid the area, although it officially remained closed. They talked about strange lights moving in the sky and that the forest was moving without wind. Some saw human-like figures, but without faces, that appeared at the edges and disappeared when they were looked at directly. These stories were not confirmed, but they created an atmosphere in which the very fact of observation became dangerous. Secret work has begun in the capital to study the anomaly. The commissions, which included leading scientists, psychiatrists, and military engineers, tried to understand what had happened. But the deeper they delved into the documents and evidence, the more they felt the pressure of an alien consciousness. Many of them recorded hallucinations, feelings of someone else's presence, and the inability to concentrate. Some began to see symbols similar to those on the object. Symbols moved in their minds, forming meaningful structures, but containing meaning beyond human comprehension. Part 4 completes the description of the first stage of the object's external influence. Its consciousness, expanded beyond the capsule, begins to influence the world outside the camp, causing strange mental and physical phenomena. In the next, 5th part, the story will move towards the final disclosure of the nature of the object and its purpose, as well as attempts to interact with the outside world and the consequences for human civilization. After external observations and archives recorded the anomalies, the object in the taiga gradually ceased to be just a physical body. He became a presence that spread not through space, but through consciousness. Everyone who tried to approach the area of the fall was confronted not with a material body, but with the feeling that the space around it had ceased to be a boundary. The air lay in a dense layer on his chest. The light began to reflect not objects, but the internal structures of the mind, and his own movements turned into reflections of someone else's will. Those who survived the first reconnaissance missions reported an inability to distinguish the past from the present. Time has lost its linearity. One officer claimed that he saw himself at the same time in the camp, at home and among the expedition, but in each place he was both alive and did not exist. His perception coincided with the inner field of the creature, which gradually expanded its influence on everyone who approached the zone. After a short time, the ground around the epicenter became unpredictable. Trees bent not in the wind, but under the pressure of thoughts. Snow moved along imaginary trajectories, and the stones underfoot obeyed not gravity, but the rhythm of the creature. At first, external observers perceived this as a physical anomaly, but it quickly became clear that physics was only part of the phenomenon. The creature influenced consciousness by embedding itself in the memory and emotions of everyone who tried to observe it. People saw their fears and hopes, their ancestral memories and other people's dreams, and it all merged into a single field. The inner world of each participant has become part of a single structure. Those who tried to resist lost the coordinates of their I. Those who succumbed felt like they were merging with something infinite, where the boundaries of identity were blurred. The archives of the vanished expedition no longer existed in the usual sense. Documents, photographs, instrument recordings, everything disappeared as if it had never existed. Those who tried to fill in the lost information were faced with the same phenomenon. Words on paper turned into abstract symbols, images moved, changed shape, and the consciousness of the person recording perceived these changes both as a fact and as an internal experience. Each document became part of a psychic network in which the past, present, and future merged. The object itself ceased to exist as a capsule or body. It has become a complete structure of consciousness. Every element of the material world that came into contact with him instantly obeyed this new logic. People stopped feeling like individuals. They became nodes in the network, merging with the presence of the being. Those who were at a distance experienced a strange feeling that their thoughts no longer belonged to them. Some reported seeing, hearing, and feeling things that weren't there. But everyone understood one thing: the consciousness of the object is spreading, and its goal is not destruction, but full integration. In the following weeks, the area around the fall expanded. Scientists trying to explore the object from the outside recorded anomalous fluctuations in the magnetic and gravitational fields. But even if the devices showed numbers, they could not be interpreted. They reflected not the physical state, but the state of the field of consciousness. People who were outside the epicenter began to experience the phenomena of the invasion of someone else's mind. Thoughts surfaced on their own, memories became shared, dreams turned into a collective experience. Each step brought them closer to the border, where the material body lost its meaning, and existence passed into a new dimension. There was no physical structure inside the camp itself, now completely dissolved into the creature's field. Snowy hills, trees, and a funnel became part of a single consciousness, where every movement and every thought obeyed the internal rhythm of the object. People no longer distinguished between themselves and the object. Every moment was simultaneously perception, reality and illusion. Those who tried to record the event in their diaries felt that the words disappeared as soon as they appeared, and the attempt to record the experience turned into an experience that could not be divided into parts. The creature, once humanoid, was now fully integrated into space and consciousness. It did not interact with people directly. Its presence was a fundamental condition of existence. It didn't demand submission, it didn't threaten. It was there. But his being changed the world, leaving no room for the usual human reality. Those who tried to resist felt emptiness, loss of coordinates, and the impossibility of action. Those who allowed consciousness to dissolve became part of a structure in which the past, present, and future are inseparable. There was a final shift in the final awareness. The area of the fall has completely disappeared from the map. Not physically, but as a space perceived by the human mind. All attempts to get there ended with a feeling of emptiness, a non-existent area where one could neither stand, move, nor think in the usual ways. And only the memory of the remaining observers, if you can call it that, recorded, there was an object here that did not come from Earth, and now it has integrated the consciousness of humanity into a network where the boundaries of individuals have disappeared. People outside the zone never saw the capsule again, did not feel its body. But the memory that it existed has not disappeared. It remained in the form of a feeling of emptiness, sound, light, or breathing, an experience that cannot be described, but which could be experienced by anyone at the same time. And therein lay the main mystery. The object was not a threat in the conventional sense. He was the return of something that existed beyond human perception. He was not an alien, he was not a machine. He was a condition that turned out to be higher than reason, higher than space, higher than life. When the observers realized this, it was too late. The expedition, the archives, the trees, the snow, and even time have ceased to exist in their usual form. Everything merged into a single network in which human consciousness became part of a new reality, a subordinate entity that came not to conquer, but to integrate. It was the end, but at the same time the beginning of another existence, incomprehensible to the human mind, but at the same time accessible through a sensation that remained forever in memory, where it cannot be forgotten. That was the end of the story of the fallen satellite, which no one launched, and no one else could call it an event in the usual sense. It has become an experience, a form of being that has gone beyond words, time, and space, leaving behind only one feeling: The world as we knew it has changed forever.